Good morning and welcome to the Diocese of Washington School for Christian Faith and Leadership and the course Vacation Bible School for the Whole Parish. I'm the Reverend Emily Snowden and I am the program coordinator for the school. I'll be your digital host today, so if you have any technical questions, you can message me directly in the chat. We are so glad that you are here today. We have a rich opportunity to learn from the Reverend Siobhan Wilkinson about intergenerational practices for Vacation Bible School. Siobhan is the associate at St. John's Episcopal Church in Olney, Maryland. A graduate from the University of California at Berkeley, she's a transplant to the DC area. She grew up in the Diocese of Los Angeles and then served as the youth and family minister at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church in Palm Desert, becoming a founding member of the Diocesan Youth Council in the Diocese of San Diego. After graduating from the Virginia Theological Seminary in 2012, she has spent the first 9 years of her priesthood exploring how to craft discipleship paths in parishes, service 3 individual parishes, as well as serving as a regional chaplain, consulting with parishes on how to build more holistic formation ministries. Her call and passion are intergenerational ministries and simultaneous learning. A mother of 4 elementary-age children, she is focused on creating formation ministries that recognize that formation happens every day of the week, and the role of the church is empowerment and equipment for individuals and households to go out and do the work they have been given to do. And with that, I will turn it over to Siobhan. Welcome, Siobhan, and thank you.
My pleasure. It is a privilege. It's always a privilege when you get asked to talk about a topic that you care so much about. And I am just so excited. So many people wanted to join me this morning to talk about it. So I'm going to share my screen because I made a little, oops, hit the wrong button. I made a little presentation around it so that I can, frankly, stay on track. So here we go. Let me see. So intergenerational Vacation Bible School, I just wanted to give you a little background on how we stumbled upon it at our parish. So at the time, before I was officially the associate at St. John's Episcopal Church, I was functioning as the chaplain for the region of Northern Montgomery County, which is north of DC. It's the most north region in the DC diocese. And so I was supposed to be going into parishes and helping them sort of fix and troubleshoot various areas around youth ministry or family ministry or Sunday school. And so when I came to St. John's, they in the last decade had a tricky situation with a rector that had been a mess in the parish. There'd been a huge divide in the parish. And so they had just sort of done this very long stability holding pattern. And they had a new rector who happened to have been a classmate of mine during seminary. And he called me up and said, here's our situation. And can you help us rebuild our children, youth, and family formation programs? So I started with that and was helping them troubleshoot, mostly by helping them ask themselves, instead of the question they were asking themselves, which was, what were we at our heyday prior to this big, ugly situation with a rector? That had been the focus of basically like, how do we rebuild what we had back in like 1992? Which is not an apropos question anymore because it's been a long time since 1992. And a lot of the best practices, frankly, have shifted. But also helping them think through what it was that they were actually hoping to achieve. And with that work that I did with them, I ended up landing a job as the associate there and sort of putting feet on all of these things. So getting swept up in some of their pieces of nostalgia, I helped them rebirth a Vacation Bible School for children in the area. And we did a Madeline Langle themed Vacation Bible School. We had some 75 to 100 kids in the area, most of whom were not parishioners, all there, plus the entire cohort of teenagers hoping for service learning hours to come and support this Vacation Bible School. And it was wonderful. It felt wildly successful. We left excited and with my team super ready to plan for next year. And so we took a brief break. We had done that Vacation Bible School at the end of the summer. because we had recognized there's a lack of camps at the end of the summer. Most vacation Bible schools happen right off the bat. And up in northern Montgomery County, at the end of August, there's almost no camps. And so families, especially struggling with childcare, really are looking. So we thought, oh, here's our opportunity. We'll minister to all of these children. And so what ended up happening is I left that feeling really good. And then we came out the other side and we looked at how many people visited the parish after that, of all of these children that we had no contact with before. We tried to see if like a single one of those families came to St. John's in the following weeks or even months. And none of them did. So after about a month of sitting and stewing and thinking, as well as thinking about that initial process I had done when I was consulting with this church about what it was that their actual formation goals were, I sat down with my key volunteers. I had two that were my key volunteers, and I said, I want to blow it all up, and I want to do something entirely different next year. And so I explained all of my reasons, which I'm about to explain to you, and I got them on board for this process. So what we ultimately needed to do is we needed to come back to the purpose of church and what it was that we were hoping to offer. Hang on, sorry, I'm trying to, there we go. So there's a model of church that we're all very familiar with. I think a lot of us were raised in a model of church very similar, where we assumed an environmental model of church, that to make disciples, it meant surrounding people in the most Christian things we could, so that discipleship was in everything. And we were the ones like running that time and constructing it. So I grew up in Southern California. And so I grew up right down the street from Saddleback Church, which was one of the key players in this model, in terms of like, you replace everyone's busyness with the busyness that is church. You divide everybody out by age, so that like you have your lower elementary school group and your upper elementary school group and your middle school group and your youth group, and you have your young families, and then your people in your 30s and 40s. Like, you really subdivide everybody out. And then you take all of their busy schedule and you make them feel guilty about it. And then you make a busy schedule at church instead. So that now, instead of going to the secular karate studio, they're doing martial arts at church. And instead of going to the secular yoga studio, they're doing yoga at church. And so that you're replacing all of their schedule with new busyness that they now get to do through you, so that you're touching them all the time in the hopes that they become great disciples. This is in contrast to a model that we're coming back to, that is a more older style model of all things church, where we put church in the DNA of the household. And I use household purposefully because not all households are nuclear families. Some households are single individuals or friendship roommate situations, or frankly, any number of ages and shifts in, the Sesame Street idea of what households can mean. And so I use that purposefully to say that we want church to be in the DNA of the household. It was a question that I put to my volunteers of paying dividends. And I said, we can spend this time with this very young subset of kids, and we can say we get 3 hours a day with them, 5 days during 1 week of time, in the hopes that maybe they'll come back next year to Vacation Bible School. And that in that 3 hours a day for 5 days, we've somehow told them they're a beloved child of God, and it somehow stays with them. And this is a belief I have subscribed to for a long time, and I don't think it is wrong. I think there is something intrinsically important about making sure children know that they're a beloved child of God. And as much as I like to emphasize the importance of getting to teach and be around children, I also know as a parent that like there's a very limited scope of the people who have influence on my children beyond myself. Even their teachers, who they see 5 days a week for 180 days a year, have a very limited amount of access to influence and time with them. And so while they can teach and do lots of things in the hopes of getting something across, there is nothing like reinforcement in the home. That the holy household is what builds a good Christian disciple, not whether or not they're in front of me as much as possible. On top of which, it just is not possible. People are busy, that I do not want to reproduce travel baseball, and I do not want to reproduce ballet lessons. There's no need to, and I can't frankly do it as well as the people who do that all the time. So I would rather find ways that I can make that household feel holy, so that when they're at travel baseball and they're missing church on Sunday morning, they have a way of praying as a household, rather than me assuming that if they're not in front of me or in my building or with my community getting the right teaching, that they're still finding ways to infuse Christianity into their DNA. So we sat down and we talked through this, and I said, I really think if we're going to make a lasting impact and that it's going to match the whole rest of our formation plan, we need to change our Vacation Bible School to assume that the whole parish should show up, that every household belongs there, that we can't teach children outside of the context of also empowering and teaching their parents, so that they know what's happening during the day, like during that time, so that they have the tools to continue those conversations, so that they also feel empowered. Not to mention that the entirety of the church, to assume that somebody who's in their 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s is fully formed as a Christian, seems really problematic in and of itself. That there's formation we're always doing, there's ways we can grow and change, there's lessons the 5-year-old can teach the whole parish, and there's lessons the 95-year-old can teach the whole parish. And so we wanted to see how that could play out in a larger scale. So we sat down, we mapped out our whole picture of formation again, and we said, okay, for this to work, what would this Vacation Bible School have to look like? So we moved it to nighttime. We picked the first week of August in the summer, because in our area, summer swim is a big deal. And so that takes up the evening hours for a lot of families, and August becomes sort of a dead time. So we chose that first week when summer swim was done, but possibly before families would necessarily jump ship and go on vacation. And we decided we had to serve food so that we could make the argument that this is less work for you. We had to go to our leadership teams across the board and get buy-in from the vestry, because we assumed we were going to take a huge hit in numbers for Vacation Bible School. And we had to repaint the picture of nostalgia that was in everyone's mind about the days that they remember being in Vacation Bible School and what that looked like and felt like for them. And we had to remind them that the number of people that are in those memories for them that aren't back in the church spoke volumes about its effectiveness as a long-term ministry of the church. So while we had good fuzzy feelings about it, we wanted to paint a picture that said, but can we do it better and differently, and maybe pay dividends differently than we have expected in the past? We also looked at our volunteer team very thoughtfully and chose specifically from lots of, I don't know that I want to use the word cliques, but I sort of want to use cliques of the church. That we tried to find different communities and groups so that we'd pull in different people, so that if I created, we have a main kitchen team. And so I grabbed one of the couples who were a part of that. And suddenly I had 6 of that group of people who were all in their 60s, would never have signed up for Vacation Bible School on their own, frankly, because they no longer have small children. And again, with that nostalgia model of what VBS meant, they didn't think that they applied. So suddenly I had this huge group of people in my kitchen that were of a different age category than normally were in Vacation Bible School, and we pulled them into the mix. We did that across the board. We tried really hard to grab people who wouldn't necessarily invest themselves in Vacation Bible School, except we asked them to come and help and serve, and then they were willing to be a part. And we made it really clear that no volunteer wasn't also a participant in our Vacation Bible School. We also picked and created carefully. I personally like to write my own Vacation Bible Schools, which I know is not everybody's favorite, because it's a lot of heavy lifting on the front end. But we picked and created carefully our activities for the event, because we didn't want to make them all kid oriented. Parents have a spirituality beyond their children. And therefore, just because you've made something at the level of a 5-year-old does not mean that you have fed all the adults in the room by the nature of them having good feelings about wanting to serve the 5-year-olds. So we tried really hard to make sure our activities were diverse in their scope, that they created opportunities for older and younger to work together, and that we had moments that were more adult geared than kid geared. And I'm going to go into some of those details in a second. I also, in general, consider my job as a priest in the parish a cheerleader for Jesus. And when we started this up, I became also a cheerleader for Intergenerational Vacation Bible School. And I dropped it in as often as I could, into parish announcements, into random moments in my sermon, into various conversations with people of the church that I would invite, and I would invite, and I would tell them to bring friends, and then I would invite them again. And I did it always with a smile, and I tried to not be naggy, but I can tell you that my entire parish could tell you all about our Vacation Bible School because I brought it up as often as humanly possible, and invited them to sign up. And I had links, in my back pocket, so to speak, for them to sign up. I also reframed both the expectations of our vestry, the leadership teams, my rector, and even myself, because like I said, we were coming out of what we considered a very successful Vacation Bible School of 100 some kids. There was hopes of, again, that nostalgic feeling of remember when we had 200 and we can keep building and doing this. And so I had to internally say, what is the number that makes me feel like this is a success? What are my new barometers of success? Because numbers can make me feel really successful in the short term. And I can feel like, wow, it was wonderful because I had 100 kids. They all had a great time. They all participated. But once I had to reframe and say, but what am I actually saying is successful? And we started saying we would be really happy if we had numbers of 40 to 50 people, which would be somewhere in the realm of, 10 households signing up. If we could get 10 households of the parish signing up, we would feel really successful about it. Every time we had a family from the parish invite a family or household from outside the parish, and we got one of those signups, we took that as a huge celebration of success. And after the Vacation Bible School ended, the number of those households that continued coming to church even once a month or came to drop by, we considered a success as well. So we used different markers than often come up in our typical framework of Vacation Bible School. And we upheld that to our leadership community, especially our vestry, as they were looking and assessing with us. So the things that we found really helpful to keep in mind, if this is something you're hoping to change your parish over to or add in addition to a kid-only Vacation Bible School, one of the things is that adults like a map differently than a kid. Kids are very happy to walk in and let you lead them by the nose because that's more of their life, that they have more realities where adults keep the schedule and they just walk through it, and they are much more adaptable and flexible to these things. Adults like to know what's happening. So we right off the bat made newsletters every day that when they walked in for dinner, that we called it, our first one was a Harry Potter themed intergenerational one, which we also picked a theme purposefully that we thought could span an interest level across the generation. And we'd have a newsletter that came in owl mail to each individual household where they had a scope of not only what was happening, but what the Bible scripture was that day, how it tied to Harry Potter, and why it was we chose the activities that day. And it said it like directly, not discreetly, where it would be like, we are making wands. Why? Because we're talking about the tools of Christ, and this is a tool of wizardry. We spelled it out so the parents felt very empowered, or the household members felt very empowered to know what was happening, and that they knew how to guide the other people at their table, frankly. We also, a thing to keep in mind is that children are story-based, and it stays for a long time. Children, even up through middle school, really need the story aspect. And so we chose to use a book as our theme because we could ahead of time invite families to read the book together or households to read the book together. We did a large parish book study with adults and kids and all sorts of stuff about reading through the first Harry Potter series or the first Harry Potter book. So that we could really get that story. And then all of our scriptures, rather than being pithy one-liners, were also stories so that they connected to whatever the theme from Harry Potter that we were working on, so that the kids got stories. That being said, adults like lessons, and they like to assume that what are we getting out of it is a big thing you hear a lot. So making sure that whatever we emphasized the story and we made very clear connections to where it is that we were trying to help guide and go with where the story is going. And to hold those two things in tension the whole time, I will admit, is not easy, because the kids couldn't care less about the lesson and they are unlikely to come home with the lesson. And so you sort of have to strike that from your expectation, but the adults really do like to have it. That being said, stories are like comfort food for adults. And so they don't mind having the story in their back pocket either. And frankly, when you're working with Gen X and millennials, you can't assume that their formation was phenomenal in the first place. And so a lot of these stories we found were not familiar necessarily to the parents of these children the way that we had assumed they would be. And then we found ourselves really reintroducing scripture to a number of their parents, who then felt better about being able to guide, navigate, and continue to empower their own kids with those stories. So that ties into the next point, is don't expect the parent or any adult in the room to have a more advanced faith. So often we assume that the adults in the room should all be the leaders because they're further along in their own faith journeys. And that is not, as it turns out, the case. We had some middle schoolers who were phenomenal in their faith development and how they took these pithy statements and moments to help guide and turn, and some adults who felt really lost. And that was across the ages of adults. But they definitely had different questions. They wanted to go into different parts of the story than the kids, where some of the details around that the kids would focus on just struck us differently. So for instance, one of the days that week we were doing spiritual gifts. And so we used scripture from Paul's letter to 1 Corinthians. And we had moments where the adults wanted to relate it back into race and class distinctions and gender distinctions, and had all sorts of where they could see all the subdivides in society. And the kids just kept looking at us and being like, well, of course, everybody's so different. And so they took it to an entirely different lesson, where they really wanted to deep dive and explore what they were good at and what they could bring to the table, versus the adults who were so busy unpacking their own biases and distinctions that they saw within society, saw within themselves, and they wanted to sort of have tools to undo some of that process. And so it was an entirely different concept and balancing act, frankly, of trying to be with the kids where they were without laying a whole lot of adult unpacking on them, and be where the adults were without trying to make it so superficial that we stayed where the kids were with wanting just to feel empowered with their own gifts. The other thing is, we found to really invite clearly. If you have expectations of everyone participating in this club cloodle, so to speak, then you say it. You spell it out in the instructions. So for instance, every single day we had a house challenge. We divided our households into 4 teams, so to speak. We called them the Hogwarts houses. And so we had the Slytherins, and we had the Hufflepuffs, and we had them all seated at tables, and we purposely mixed up household types and families and ages. And so when we had a house challenge, it meant everyone participated. And that meant if you had a 2-year-old in your group, you found a way to help make sure that they were a part. And if you had an 85-year-old in your group, you found a way to make sure that they were a part. And each challenge each day led to different, challenges on how that played out. So for instance, one day they had to build a puzzle in silence. So they opened their challenge box, it had a puzzle, and in the instructions, it really clearly stated that every member of your household is to put a puzzle piece in. So it meant that if you had a 3-year-old in your house, you had to find a way silently to help that 3-year-old navigate placing their puzzle piece in the puzzle with the group. Doing so and saying it so directly meant that the adults didn't back up and just assume it was a kid activity, which is something that we assume in society, that when there's an activity going on, the adults assume that their job is to sort of support and let the kids do it. And it also meant that we didn't leave behind our preschool set who were all there and wanted to participate, but some of it absolutely was beyond their scope. And so they really did need empowerment. And so we saw family members from different, like household members from different family groupings supporting and engaging with people across the ages so that they could make sure that they all participated and how they could participate. And the last thing that we really took to heart was that you will not win everyone over in the way you want to. At our particular one, we had 2 dads that showed up that would never, ever participate in the activities, that they would default to backing up. Their wives would support the kids. They were always really positive. They had great things to say, but they absolutely just walked around the room chatting with other dads, generally speaking, that is all they did. And you know what? It was okay. They left with their kids feeling empowered. They still heard all the messages. They left with a good experience. We found that it didn't, more than just a few minutes, it didn't distract other people. Like when they would sit, they'd chat with other people and then they'd end up moving because that person would re-engage with their own group and want to be a part. And so then they would just move on and go chat with somebody else. And so I'm hoping in future years that we'll see those same fellows like on the scooters racing alongside of everyone else. But it was okay that that wasn't how they felt they could participate. And I think owning some of that ability of we won't win everyone over, we can't make everybody participate, but really clearly inviting them to participate again and again made a nice balance where they left with a really good experience. And maybe next time they'll feel more confident making a Harry Potter wand, so if they so be it. I'm sorry, there we go. So what we found was a helpful pattern in this planning carefully for adults and kids was, again, we found providing food was an incentive. We laid that pretty thick on there of, and we made it really cost effective, which I can't help you during COVID and diocesan restrictions on that. It's made it so that this year, again, we're postponing this style of VBS. We're sending one home to households, and I can talk about that in a minute as well. But what we found was that adding food in a way where we just invited the parish, we set up themes for our food and what we wanted. And then we set up like a, what's it called? A sign-up genius. And we had parishioners who maybe couldn't attend during the week or did attend during the week, sign up to bringing a fruit tray or a veggie platter. Or we had one night that was like a mac and cheese buffet. So we had the pasta and then the cheese you could add, and you could add meat or veggies or whatever. And that was just like we had various people bring it, and then we had our kitchen team assemble it for everybody. And then one of my volunteers tends to be super detail oriented, and I thank God for her on a daily basis because she made like little name tags on all the food, making it all sound Harry Potter themed. And so we pushed that. We were like, it's 5 days. You don't make dinner. You don't come home to dishes. We entertain and wear out your kids, especially with young families. This was a huge draw. But we set it across the board. We set it to our retired couples. And we're like, come for 5 days, get dinner, hang out with people, play with us, discuss with us. And then, it was a great time. And it definitely was a way to get people there. During this fellowship time, I already said, this is where we kind of laid out an outline for adults that included all of our whys of what was happening. We then we kicked off with a theme setting activity. If I was to say that there was an activity that was more child derived, it was this one. It was a craft. Almost never, except with the Harry Potter wands, did we have the adults do the craft. They were more in the supporting role for crafting. We have a general principle with all crafts that we refuse to send home crap, for lack of a better, less crass term, that if we're going to do a craft, it's going to be a good quality craft. It's going to match the theme, and it's going to push forward whatever it is that we would like to be talking about for that evening. And it's going to be something worth saving. So no, we did not spend tons of time on Oriental trading, getting one coloring page after another. We tried extremely hard to be like, if we're going to do a craft, it's going to be worthy of your time, and that the parents aren't just going to come home and be like, oh, more stuff I have to throw away. We wanted it something to be worthwhile. So it does also mean that your craft usually is pricier than a normal craft. And it usually takes a little bit more doing. But since we knew we were going to have a lot of intergenerational scope, and therefore teenagers and adults' hands to help, we could do stuff like hot glue up a Harry Potter wand, paint it with acrylic paint, hot glue on beads and figurines so that they could personalize their wand with dragons and gemstones, and keep everyone from getting burned and painting themselves brown in that process. So then from the craft, we went to a group challenge, and I already mentioned that this was an Everybody Plays Club Cloodle experience. We purposefully made it so that whatever the challenge was, it spelled out that every member of the household was expected to participate. And we wrote it as if it was a competition, although it never actually was a competition. And we absolutely found that by wording it like it was a race or a competition, people really deeply engaged in it, because they were like, we will win. And then nobody ever won. And after day one, you'd think they'd figure that out, but it never stopped them from getting very competitive in positive and engaging ways. So based on our theme of the day, one time we gave them huge tubs of paper tubes, which we'd saved up in masking tape. And we said, you have to build a marble racer that drops 6 feet in the air, that turns around no less than 3 times and moves across the room 4 feet out of your paper tubes. Every single member of your household is to use tape. Every single member of your household is to hold stuff. And in a minute, I have some great pictures that show you that we absolutely had 2-year-olds standing up like a tower, holding stuff while people were, frantically taping so that they could make their marble racers to demonstrate to each other. We then did a Bible video, it was actually drawn by one of our teenagers, and never be afraid to really utilize the people you have. So we gave this wonderful, amazing teenager we have scripts, and she drew still lifes that she was able to then turn into videos and lay with sound of the scripture. So we'd tell the scripture like a story. She drew it out for us, and we'd all sit and watch this Bible video that was based on the theme. We did it like pop-up video, which I then had to explain to my teenager what pop-up video was, which made me feel very old, where she drew the cartoons, and then we had little like factoids that hit up on the screen so that we could take the story further for the adults. For instance, one of our Bible stories that year was the Vashti story, and about was the Esther story. And we talked about Vashti in that. And if you're unfamiliar, that story is how Vashti is told to process, like she's supposed to be put on show by her husband, and that she gets taken, her crown and her queenship gets taken away in the process. And that is how Esther gets into the harem. So we pop-up videoed, so to speak. We had a little blurb that showed up about Vashti, and what that actually meant was that she refused to walk around the party naked, to parade around. We also had pop-ups about the fact that really Esther was joining a harem for the king. These were things that obviously older elementary school kids can read and can encourage conversation in the household later, about like what a harem means, and about like what that would mean to take responsibility and say like, I will not walk around the party naked. But it also meant that like your kinder through 2nd grade couldn't read it if they could read it, they couldn't read it fast enough to necessarily get the full gist of it. And so we weren't saying it out loud in such a way that parents were like threatened about showing things that were age sensitive to a large spectrum. But we were able to get that information so that we could dig deeper with older people, while also keeping it so that the kids weren't necessarily hearing a lot of things that would be really hard to sit and unpack with them. This is also where we actually did do breakout groups based on age. This was the only time we broke out groups based on age, and it was so that we could have an adult conversation. We had a K through second grade conversation. We had a preschool room, and we had a 3rd through 5th grade room. And the first 2 rooms, pre-K and K through 2nd, we really just retold the story with them, where we had their volunteers act out the story so that we stayed very story-based with our youngest people. And 3rd through 5th grade was where we started moving the conversation up a little bit and trying to help them make some amount of connection. The middle and high school kids, we actually did those small groups before Vacation Bible School. They came early because they considered themselves our volunteer team, but they participated in almost everything. But that was how they could run the discussion groups for the pre-K, kinder through 2nd, and 3rd through 5th, because we had already done their individual time previously. But it then left us so that the adults weren't having to run the small group times for the kids, and it gave us an adult time to have real Bible study, which was across the generations. We had people who were young and newly married in their late 20s, all the way through some of our 80-something parishioners in a room having small group discussions about the Bible story. And then then we moved to a next step activity. And this one was something that was meant to be for each individual household. So for instance, we did things around family trees for one time, about what gives us roots and what gives us branches and helps us branch off. And we talked about our support structures. We did things about spiritual gifts in this time, where we took it to new levels. I'm going to show you some pictures in a second, and I'll show you some of that. But the next step was not a craft. It was purposefully meant to be like, where do you go from here? So that it was an activity that the kids engaged in and felt empowered by. But for adults, it was a method of taking them to where their brain can be like, okay, so I have this secular story, I have this Bible story, now what? Like, how does it apply further from just today or this fun experience? And then finally, we ended in Compline every single night. And the very and the very last night of the week, which was Friday for us, we ended in Eucharist, and we did a big Eucharist all together. Of course, it poured. We were going to do a big outdoor one, but poured. So we did a big indoor Eucharist, all as a big group with all of our songs from VBS. So here's a couple pictures. This is our 2 building, and you can see that actually that's my daughter up on the table right there. And you can see we have a middle schooler. We have an adult that's not actually a member of our family unit who was in their house, all trying to build these tubes. This was scooter racing from our group challenge on Wednesday. We required everyone to be a part. We wanted adults on scooters. And so we had all sorts of races that involved partner racing, or laying on your tummy and racing and being pushed. And we tried to pick categories that meant that not every adult had to be able to sit on a scooter, but they still could participate somehow by pushing somebody or pulling somebody or cheering on somebody. You can see we even have a baby, therefore, in the mix in the partner scootering, so that everybody was involved. For our next step activity, when we were doing spiritual gifts, we gave everyone a shirt from St. John's that had our mission statement in the back. And we gave them options that were like, if I'm put in a social setting, I want to A, crawl into a hole, B, go read a book somewhere else by myself, C, talk to people I already know, D, meet every single new person there. And then you'd run to whatever corner it was, and you would write whatever it was on someone else's shirt, wherever you were in your corner. And then when we'd get back together as individual households, they would compare and say, look, mom and dad are introverts and they like to hang out by themselves and read a book. But look, Johnny and Sally both wanted to meet every new person in the room. Isn't that interesting as a family grouping that came out that way? And then we encouraged conversation on how does that help? How does it help in a family to have some people who want to meet everybody and some people who would rather, have time by themselves, for instance. You can see in this, the top corner is one of our small groups of the adults talking. It was definitely a mixed subset of people who were not people who would have hung out probably on their own on a Sunday morning. And actually not all of the people in that picture are parishioners, so some were invited guests. You can see one of our holy households of retired folks whose kids are long grown and now have great grandchildren who are participating in our next step activity about family trees. And we were writing in our roots, the people who we felt gave us roots as a household. And then in our branches, our friends and the people we've added in through Christ's community that help us grow and spread out and learn. And it was a whole household activity. So we wrote everybody's attributes. And so every November, my own family puts this out. It's framed now, and it's someone we keep continuously add to of the people in our household that have continued to add to our discipleship and give us, build branches on our Christian household tree. And this is Compline. The kids are dancing, the parents are singing along, and we have a whole set of mismatch of people. I always love this picture because the woman in red in the center hates to sing. She lives in my neighborhood and I like to tease her. So I was like, and we're singing and we're going to hear Carrie sing the loudest. And she always is a good sport about it, but she always wishes we would sing less in church. So it was fun, but her daughter is actually the one directly in front of her dancing so much that she's blurry. So it tells you exactly their level of musicality, that they have a daughter who loves it and a mom who's not so into it. And we had a mixed bag. So I will stop sharing so I can see all your lovely faces and answer whatever, if I can figure out how to stop sharing. There it goes. Answer whatever questions I can help with. I've been remiss in the chat. Okay, so I'll run down the chat. I did rename the program. We called it Intergenerational Vacation Bible School at first, and then we really pushed it as like the Harry Potter theme. And I'm now trying to remember offhand what we called our Harry Potter. We push also an idea of holy households a lot. And so when we announced it, we talked a lot about this is a holy household activity. And it's something meant for the entirety of the church. If you have a household, you were invited. We did work ahead of time with the book studies, which absolutely did engage, therefore, some of our older parishioners, because I will admit, I'm in my late 30s. And so Harry Potter came out a little after when I had started reading, I'd sort of stopped reading kids' novels at the point that I was when Harry Potter started. And so some of my peers got into Harry Potter, but I hadn't at the time. So reading Harry Potter was relatively new to me when I was having kids. And so older than me, especially, that was true, that not all of the people were immersed in that world, but had a lot of questions because they'd seen the movies or they had heard of the world. And so we did book studies, and we actually had a lot of 80-year-olds in that book study that wanted to read Harry Potter and ask a lot of questions. And then last year, when we did our COVID version of this, we did Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, which we had rewritten to go home with people. And that book group also was attended intergenerationally to talk about the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so that really helped push the different aspects. We didn't take questions as a whole group, is how we handled the questions after hearing the story. We immediately divided into smaller groups to do it, so that we could address it that way. And what we did is the first half of the adult discussion was trying to find ways to answer their questions that they thought their kids might have. Because what we found with some of the adults in the room that had households with children is that they came to the table ready because they had sat watching the video with their kid. So they heard it, right? They heard the chiming of the 4 or 5-year-old saying well, why wouldn't she walk around the room and whatever. So then we'd sit down, and immediately, without even asking the question, we had a whole bunch of adults who'd be like, okay, my 6-year-old's already asking why on earth they would make her parade around naked. So talk to me about how I talk about that. So that when they went home in the car ride, they were ready, with some amount of having thought through the story a little more, so that they could be okay, so not everybody's respectful of other people's body autonomy, or whatever was the right words for their household and that they were already using. We used it as a time to equip. And then because it was intergenerational, we had grandparents in the room who some of these questions had to answer before at various times. And they were so wonderful about being like, oh, well, when my middle schooler was doing that, let me tell you what helped. And sometimes that was really helpful. And sometimes it was just something funny because you were like, wow, we couldn't do that anymore. And even some of them acknowledge, you're like, oh, when we had a high schooler, we did blah, 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 but that's not socially acceptable anymore or whatever. And we had it created a great bouncing of ideas. And furthermore, that stuck. Like, speaking of paying dividends, like the cross pew contamination at our church is so strong now across levels. I will admit, and this partially comes from our prayer partner ministry, which is the topic for next week, if you're all interested. But the very first Sunday that we could do in-person mass, my 5-year-old took a running leap at her prayer partner, who is a very agile 70-year-old, thankfully, because he caught her midair, and she was masked and he was masked, and thankfully he was fully vaccinated and wasn't concerned about it. But she, was so excited to see him. And it's beautiful to see the amount of cross-generational interaction from things like this. Especially this really pollinated the church differently about who talks to who and who has relationship with who and where these conversations are happening. The household group challenges really do work when you have a lot of your congregation older, because you just design them differently. So we knew who we thought was going to sign up, and we designed activities that we knew could be a conversation piece for a household. So like, we knew we could do family trees because we didn't have a lot of single people that were coming. Or that we knew that our young people who were in their 20s and newly married also actually were at that parish because their parents were at that parish, which happens to be a dynamic in Olney. But we really constructed it thoughtfully and carefully, asking ourselves the question a lot about who our audience was for this, and then revisiting and saying, okay, wait, we can't do that because Jerry is not going to be able to be involved at all, because he walks with a cane. So he's not going to be able to participate with this. So how do we make it so he can participate with this? And so that's really one of the hard pieces of lifting ahead of time that you end up doing, is modifying based on your group so that whatever your next step really matches where your mindsets are going to be of your group. So that you can target the most people. We held it, we started at 6 for this, because of this balance that you mentioned, Mary, of trying to get home from work and kids' bedtime. And we did it during summer, and then openly admitted that some of the young people would leave early. So what ended up happening is that families who only had preschoolers tended to leave after the Bible study and not participate in the next step activity, because that landed at about 7:45, 8. And that was like, they were like, this is as far as we can push it, because we had to do 3 hours. We couldn't find a way to shove it smaller. We couldn't do earlier than 6 because we couldn't figure out a way for most people to be able to get there before 6. And 6 was pushing it for most people. And so we were asking for a heavy lift on both sides of the equation, and we admitted it. We said, like, we know that we're asking you to take off work early for a week, and we know that's hard. And then we said to families who have littles, and we said, we know we're asking you to stay up later than your norm, and we're there with you. Like, we will support you how you'd like us to support you on that. And ultimately, like I said, some families left. The families who only had littles, like littles, left early, and we would supply them with the extra stuff to do it beyond then. Families like mine who have a mix of preschool and elementary schoolers stayed, because our poor young ones end up staying later anyway, more frequently because of the older kids. And then families that were used to a later schedule and then had to take off work early. Like, everybody was making a little bit of sacrifice, and it seemed after some cheerleading that people were willing to sort of go for it with us. You could absolutely do it as a series of weeks, or versus every night in 1 week. You just design it that way. You think it through so that there's continuity points. We found for summer, it was easier to ask for the 1 week. But the fall, like, so last year with COVID, what we ended up doing was we gave people, we had already written it. And so we changed the dynamic of the whole program to be over 1 week. That one day became 1 week. And so we focused on it as a parish. We changed, and we had a sermon series that matched that theme for the week. And then those 5 activities we gave to every household, and we sent out email reminders. And then they had a whole week to do those activities as a household. And then we had touchstone Zoom moments, and we had Zoom worship at the end of each week to try to connect back with everybody. And it seemed to work well. We had a lot of engagement, especially even in just the sermons, or like people would connect with one piece. But I think if based on your parish, if you find with families saying 1 month of Friday nights makes more sense, or 1 month of Sunday coffee hour timeframes that you come after church and we're going to start with worship and go till noon, you find the balance of the people you're serving, and that you think that you will get the most bang for your investment, basically, which is your investment of time so that they are being equipped for discipleship. Did station across from Lent geared for youth and adults doing our project for each station? Yes, exactly. I love that, Mary. It's absolutely possible. It just speaks to looking at your community and what it is that works, and what their expectations are, frankly. In this area, Vacation Bible School is a really big deal. So moving the Vacation Bible School mindset model and saying, instead of a week with your kids out of the house, we're asking you to come with them, was something they understood. But if you're in an area where VBS is not culturally normative, you can be more creative with that process. Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, we have a few more minutes. I put Siobhan alluded to the prayer partner class that she's teaching next week, same time. I'm putting that in the chat right now, so you can register on Eventbrite if you want. Again, intergenerational focus on how to use prayer partners to continue to cross-pollinate in your congregation. But we have a few more minutes, so if there are any other questions, feel free to lift those up. Do you think it needs to be around a book?
I don't. We found for our parish that it helped because it gave us some amount of shared material that we could lift up across the groups. The one that was planned for this year that we're postponing is a Dr. Seuss based one. So that was a whole bunch of children's books. So that's a good question, what our plans are for this summer. So what we were going to do an outdoor Seuss one, but the Diocese of Washington plus COVID has a number of food restrictions, and on top of which we had volunteer concerns about actually making it intergenerational, because we have a number of our key volunteers had concerns about children are not vaccinated. And so depending on which, where people's risk assessments are, for some people that's like a non-starter, that they don't want to be around children right now. And so we were trying to, we didn't want to lose our intergenerational aspect this year because of that fear. And so we postponed our Seuss one. So this year, what we're doing is a weekly series based on Paul's letters, so that the adults in the parish can read the letter in its entirety, and the kids of the parish are getting a pithy piece of it, like a storyline from it. And then we're using acts and we're focusing on virtues, and we're doing a sermon series around it that way, and sending home activities like more like last year, except last year we only did it over the month of August. And this year we're doing a little bit longer haul. And since we actually can do more meeting together, we're going to have a couple of outdoor touchstones during the summer that are going to be like bring your own s'mores and do sort of a fire pit gathering and do some moments with it. But there's such limitations around concerns around shared materials and shared space. And we just didn't want to put people in a circumstance where we would lose the intergenerational aspect, or we would be asking people to put themselves in a situation that they didn't feel comfortable with. So we rather postponed for a year. But I don't think you have to use a book. We just found it easier to use some shared amount of material. We're already actually working on what would have been next year's, but now is the year after. And we're going to do Mr. Rogers and talk about mercy and forgiveness using Mr. Rogers. And that's not a book, but it is a shared cultural world and identity. We have found it's easier to use something that has some amount of world that you can enter into, so that everybody can have a shared stepping away experience where you walk in and it's something not normal. So it takes them out of themselves a little bit. And yeah, some anti-racism for kids series can be really moving and helpful. And it can be a big process in terms of anti-racism, because like I said, kids have a very different experience of bias and racism. And it's interesting because you neither want to create in them an expectation of it, where they aren't yet experiencing or seeing it, but you also need to address it so that it doesn't develop. And so it's a harder work. And so that one is not one I wouldn't write that myself. And so that is something I prefer the work of other people who are smarter and more impactful and have perhaps more diverse backgrounds than I have, so that I can dig deeply appropriately.
Any last questions?
Wonderful. Yes, exactly. In consultation with two women of color. Yes. And yes, absolutely. It just depends on who you have and what resources you have to do it with.
Well, thank you so much, Siobhan. We so appreciate your willingness to share with us. Folks have expressed that it is really been really helpful. And I sort of wish I was in a parish right now so I could implement some of the ideas. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. We will send out the recording to you so that you have it within the next day or so. And we hope that you'll join us next week for Prayer Partners. Again, 10 a.m. Feel free to click on the link and the Eventbrite link. Or you can go online and find it there too. So thank you again, Siobhan. Thanks everyone for being here. And we hope to see you again for the School for Christian Faith and Leadership at the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. Have a great rest of your week. Take care.